She didn't touch me! Please, stop lying! Clara's voice cracked through the marble courtroom like a shattering glass. Her cheeks flushed crimson as she twisted in the witness chair, her small hands gripping the wooden armrests until her knuckles whitened. Across the aisle, Richard Halden rose halfway from his seat, his polished cufflinks catching the light as his gray eyes darkened into storms. The jury gasped. Naomi Clark's throat tightened. She sat at the defendant's table, her palms damp, her eyes darting between Clara's trembling figure and Richard's looming silhouette. For weeks, Naomi had borne the weight of an accusation that could ruin her life, that she, a maid, had struck the daughter of a billionaire. And now, with one desperate cry, the child had cracked open the truth. The judge banged his gavel. "Order in the court!" But Clara's voice lingered in the silence, echoing in Naomi's chest like a heartbeat she thought she'd lost. 2 months earlier, the Halden estate sat like a fortress at the edge of Charleston's wealthiest enclave. Columns rose high and pale against the twilight, the marble steps always spotless, as though the world's dirt had never dared touch them. Inside, the air smelled of wax and roses, but beneath it all, something colder lingered, like stone that had never seen sunlight. Naomi moved carefully across the great hall, her Navy maid's uniform pressed, her polished shoes squeaking faintly on the floor. Her long fingers clutched a silver tray of crystal glasses, the weight steady despite the ache in her wrists. She had learned to make herself invisible in this house, to glide without sound, to bow her head when Richard Halden's eyes passed over her, to endure Isabel's clipped commands as though she were no more than another piece of furniture. But Clara saw her. The girl lingered in doorways, trailing behind Naomi with soft curiosity. At 12, Clara's hair was always brushed into immaculate braids by the house stylist, her pale dresses spotless. Yet her blue eyes carried shadows Naomi recognized, the same shadows she had carried herself at that age, when silence had been safer than truth. "Naomi," Clara's whisper broke through the hush of the dining room. Do you like books?" Naomi glanced toward the grand staircase, making sure Richard wasn't near. "I do," she said softly. "Why?" Clara's fingers fidgeted with her bracelet. "Because I found one in the attic. It's about a girl who runs away. I thought you'd like it." The warmth in Naomi's chest startled her. She had spent years folding herself into obedience, but here, in this child's shy gaze, she felt seen. Richard Halden, however, never truly looked at Naomi. He looked through her. At 48, he was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark suits tailored like armor. His hair was silver at the temples, his jaw sharp as if carved from stone. He spoke in clipped commands, his voice smooth but cold, as though emotion were a weakness. One evening, at dinner, Naomi placed a dish on the table a second too late. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Punctuality is discipline. If you lack it, you don't belong here." Naomi bowed her head. "Yes, sir." Clara's fork clattered against her plate. "She's not late. You're just—" "Clara!" Isabel's voice sliced in, brittle as glass. "Manners." The girl's lips pressed shut, but Naomi caught the tremor in her eyes. Clara wanted to defend her, but in this house, no one defied Richard. The bruise appeared weeks later. It was small, on Clara's arm, just below the sleeve of her nightgown. Naomi noticed it first when she tucked the girl's sheets. "Child, what happened here?" Clara froze, her face draining pale. "Please don't tell anyone." Naomi crouched beside her, her heart thudding. "Clara, Before the girl could answer, the door creaked open. Richard stood there, shadows carving harsh lines across his face. His gaze swept from Naomi's hand on Clara's arm to the bruise itself, and his voice, low and dangerous, filled the room. "What did you do to my daughter?" Naomi rose to her feet, every muscle trembling. "Sir, I would never—" But Richard's fury was already building, his accusation loud enough to rattle the walls. The weeks that followed blurred into nightmare. Naomi was dismissed from the estate in shame. Police summoned her, pressing questions that twisted her words. Richard's lawyers painted her as unstable, even dangerous. They brought up her divorce, her financial struggles, even her younger brother's minor brush with the law, twisting it all into a portrait of a woman capable of violence. Neighbors whispered, Families she once tutored their children for free closed their doors. Naomi kept her head high, but inside, she felt hollow. Like every dream she had clawed to protect was slipping through her fingers. Only Clara's eyes haunted her, wide and filled with fear the night of the accusation. Naomi prayed the girl would speak the truth, but knew the weight of her father's shadow. Now, in the courtroom, those prayers hung heavy. Naomi sat motionless as Clara faced her father's gaze. The child's voice wavered, but her truth clawed its way free. "She didn't hit me," Clara whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Naomi never hurt me. She's the only one who's kind to me. It was—" Her lips trembled, the words snagging in her throat as Richard leaned forward, his presence towering, suffocating. "It was you, Daddy." The silence was deafening. Naomi's breath caught. The gavel struck. And in that moment, the fortress of lies Richard had built began to crack. The courtroom rippled with whispers, like a storm building under the roof. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and a murmur of disbelief swept through the gallery. Clara's small frame quivered in the witness chair, but her words had already detonated in the room. Richard Halden's lips parted, his jaw tightening as though clamping down on rage. His cufflinks gleamed as he gripped the edge of the defense table, forcing composure. His attorneys scrambled, whispering in his ear, urging him to control his temper. Naomi sat frozen. A warmth surged through her chest, a flicker of hope piercing weeks of humiliation. But it was fragile, too fragile. She knew Richard Halden was not a man who yielded. His empire was built on bending others until they broke. The judge's gavel thundered. "Order! If the gallery does not quiet, I will clear this courtroom." Clara lowered her gaze, tears dripping onto her pale dress. Naomi wanted to reach for her, to shield her from the storm about to come, but she could only watch. 2 months before the trial, humiliation had already begun its slow choke. The day after Richard discovered Clara's bruise, Naomi was summoned to the marble parlor. Richard stood at the fireplace, his broad back turned, flames licking behind the iron grate. Isabel lounged on the chaise, a glass of wine in her manicured hand, her diamond necklace winking in the light. Naomi stood rigid, her hands folded in front of her apron. "You've betrayed my trust," Richard said, not turning. His voice was calm, too calm. "You struck my child." "I didn't," Naomi whispered, her voice trembling despite her resolve. "I would never harm Clara." Richard pivoted slowly, his gray eyes slicing into her like steel. "So she bruised herself then? A 12-year-old child invented this?" Naomi opened her mouth, but Isabel cut in with a cruel little laugh. "Richard, what did you expect? These people can only behave for so long before their nature shows." Naomi's chest tightened. She had endured Isabel's veiled insults for months, but this one seared deeper, because Clara sat quietly in the corner, her eyes wide, her mouth closed, the LD's silence sealed Naomi's fate. Richard's voice turned cold. "Pack your things. You'll never set foot in this house again." The humiliation of that walk through the estate, under the watchful stares of the staff, burned into Naomi's skin. She carried her bag like a criminal being paraded. Clara's small voice echoed faintly behind her, but Naomi couldn't make out the words. Back in the courtroom, Richard's lawyers pounced. "Objection!" one barked, rising to his feet. "The child is confused, emotionally manipulated by the defendant. She has been brainwashed into protecting her abuser." Naomi's stomach dropped. To twist Clara's bravery into more lies, Richard was willing to grind his own daughter down for the sake of his image. The judge frowned. "Counsel, you'll have a chance to cross-examine, but the jury will hear this testimony." Clara wiped her eyes with trembling hands. Her voice, though fragile, pushed forward. "Naomi didn't hurt me. She was the only one who ever read to me, who ever asked me what I dreamed about. Daddy gets angry. Sometimes he squeezes my arm so hard it hurts. That's how I got the bruise." A gasp tore through the room. Naomi pressed her hands together, trying to hold herself upright as tears burned her eyes. Richard's jaw clenched, his face flushing red beneath his silver hair. He leaned toward the microphone at his table, his voice clipped and sharp. "Lies. She's a child. She doesn't know what she's saying. This woman," he jabbed a finger toward Naomi, "has filled her head with poison. She resents discipline. And now she lashes out with fantasy. My daughter is unwell. Naomi flinched at the venom in his tone, but Clara's tears were not fantasy. They were truth carved into a child's heart. The jury watched intently, their expressions shifting. Some frowned, some leaned forward, scribbling notes. For the first time, Naomi saw the cracks forming, not just in Richard's control of his daughter, but in his control of the narrative. Still, Naomi knew this battle was far from over. Richard Halden had never lost in his life. 3 weeks earlier, after Naomi's dismissal, the humiliation had worsened. Police arrived at her apartment, a modest 2-room space with faded yellow curtains and a bookshelf crammed with worn paperbacks. Neighbors peeked from doorways as Naomi was escorted into a patrol car. Though not cuffed, the implication was clear. She was dangerous. At the station, officers questioned her for hours. Did she resent her employer? Did she ever discipline Clara? Had her temper ever slipped? Naomi's answers, calm and steady, were drowned by the weight of Richard's accusation. His name carried power. Hers carried none. When she was finally released on bail, Naomi walked home in the rain, her shoes soaking through, her dignity in tatters. That night, she found a note slipped under her door, in a child's handwriting. I'm sorry, I'll fix it. Her tears blurred the words. She clutched the paper to her chest, praying Clara's small voice could ever stand against her father's empire. Now, here they were. Naomi sat straighter in her chair, though her body trembled with the memory of every humiliation, every whispered insult, every closed door. Across the courtroom, Richard stared at his daughter, as though sheer force of will could silence her. But Clara's next words were soft and devastating. I'm not lying, she said. I'm not scared anymore. Naomi pressed a hand over her mouth, choking back a sob. The courtroom, once dominated by Richard's voice, now belonged to Clara, and for the first time, Naomi dared to believe maybe truth could win. The courtroom held its breath. Clara's words still quivered in the air like a fragile flame that might be snuffed out at any second. Richard Halden sat frozen, his hand clenched into a fist on the polished oak table. His attorneys scribbled notes furiously, already plotting how to dismantle the testimony of his own daughter. His face, however, betrayed something deeper, an anger laced with fear. Naomi, seated beside her lawyer, felt her heart pound against her ribs. Every humiliation, every whispered doubt, every sleepless night had led to this moment, yet it was not her voice that carried the truth, it was Clara's, trembling, but unbroken. The judge leaned forward. We will recess for 15 minutes. His gavel struck, breaking the spell. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as people rose from the benches. Reporters rushed for the doors, ready to spill the story into the world outside. Naomi stayed seated, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes locked on Clara as the girl was gently led away by a bailiff. For a heartbeat, Clara glanced back, her gaze finding Naomi's. In that fleeting moment, Naomi gave a tiny nod, her lips whispering words the child couldn't hear. You're brave. Weeks earlier, Naomi had faced the ugliest side of the accusation. It wasn't just the police, or Richard's cold fury, or Isabel's venomous whispers. It was the weight of the community turning against her. At the grocery store, a woman she had once tutored for years pulled her child closer, avoiding Naomi's eyes. The church pew where Naomi used to sit with her younger brother remained conspicuously empty when she arrived, neighbors shifting uncomfortably as though her presence tainted the sanctuary. You can't come here anymore, the pastor had told her softly, though his words were no less cutting. It's too much distraction. Naomi walked home that day with her head lowered, her dignity shredded. She had given years of kindness to people who now turned from her at a whisper from a wealthy man. And still, she endured. Because somewhere inside her, she knew the truth was waiting to be spoken. She just didn't know if Clara would ever find the courage to speak it. Back in the courthouse hallway during recess, Richard cornered Isabel near the marble pillars. His voice was low but sharp enough for Naomi, seated nearby, to hear. You see what he's done? Richard hissed. That maid has turned my own daughter against me. Isabel's delicate features hardened. Her diamond necklace caught the fluorescent light, but her eyes darted nervously toward the reporters gathered like vultures. Richard, it's already in the press. If this spirals, it won't, he snapped, grabbing her wrist too tightly. She winced, pulling away. I built this empire. I won't let it fall because of a child's tantrum and a maid's lies. Naomi looked away, but the image seared into her, the billionaire gripping his wife the same way he must have gripped Clara's arm. When the recess ended, Clara was gone. The judge announced, "The witness will return tomorrow. For now, the defense may present its case." Richard's attorneys rose, their voices smooth, their suits impeccable. They painted Naomi as manipulative, a woman who resented her position, who sought leverage over her employer. They called her unstable, pointing to her divorce as evidence of her inability to maintain relationships. They even produced an old photo of her brother's arrest for petty theft, suggesting a pattern in the family. Each word was like a blade. Naomi sat stiffly, refusing to bow her head, but her throat burned. Finally, one attorney gestured toward her. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, look at her. Does she look like someone who belongs in a child's life?" Naomi's lawyer rose sharply. "Objection. Argumentative." But the words had already sunk into the room. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably. Naomi's cheeks burned, her dignity laid bare for strangers to dissect. That night, Naomi walked home alone. The courthouse steps loomed behind her, but the weight of shame clung like a shadow. At her apartment, she lit a small lamp and opened her bookshelf. She ran her fingers over the spines. Shakespeare, Baldwin, Morrison, voices of resilience that had carried her through darker nights. She pulled out a worn copy of The Bluest Eye, flipping to the underlined passages she had clung to since college. Her hands trembled as she read aloud softly, the words steadying her breath. In the silence of her small room, she reminded herself, she was not the lies they painted. She was more. The next morning, Naomi arrived at court to find reporters clustered around Clara and her court-appointed child advocate. The girl's face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying, but she walked with a strange determination. When she passed Naomi in the hallway, she stopped. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Clara whispered, so softly Naomi barely caught it, "I'm not going to stop." Naomi's throat tightened. She wanted to embrace the child, to thank her, but the bailiff ushered Clara forward. Inside the courtroom, Clara took the stand again. Her small hands clutched the wooden rail, her voice steadier than the day before. "Naomi didn't hurt me," she said again. "My father did." Richard's lawyers tore into her testimony, accusing her of confusion, of fantasy, of seeking attention. But Clara didn't waver this time. Her tears were real, but behind them was steel. The tension in the courtroom grew unbearable. Jurors leaned forward, reporters scribbled faster, and Isabel dabbed her temple with a silk handkerchief, pale and trembling. For the first time, Richard's voice cracked when he snapped, "Clara, stop this nonsense!" The judge slammed his gavel. "Mr. Halden, you will not address the witness directly." The silence that followed was heavy. Richard's mask was slipping. Naomi exhaled slowly. For the first time in weeks, she saw not just the possibility of truth, but the beginning of Richard's undoing. "It was you, Daddy." Clara's words hung like a sword above the courtroom, cutting deeper with each second of silence that followed. The gallery froze. Even the bailiff, usually expressionless, blinked hard as though the ground had shifted beneath him. Richards. De Halden's carefully constructed mask cracked. His face flushed crimson, his jaw working furiously. He leaned forward, both palms slamming down on the defense table with a thunderous bang. "Enough!" he roared. His voice, once a polished instrument of command, now echoed raw and unrestrained. "She's a child. She doesn't know what she's saying. She's confused, manipulated." Clara flinched, but she didn't take her words back. Her small body trembled, yet her eyes, blue, fragile, determined, remained locked on him. Naomi, seated at the defendant's table, couldn't breathe. It felt like the entire world balanced on the thin shoulders of a 12-year-old girl. The judge's gavel pounded. "Mr. Halden, sit down immediately or you will be removed from this courtroom." Richard's lawyers scrambled, tugging at his sleeve, whispering frantic pleas. But the damage was done. The billionaire had bared his temper for all to see. Naomi's mind raced back to nights at the estate. She remembered Clara's quiet knocks at her door, the child slipping into the maid's quarters with a stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. "Can I stay here just a little while?" Clara would whisper. Naomi would nod, pulling a blanket over her lap as she set aside her book. "Of course, child." They would sit together in silence. Sometimes Clara leaned against Naomi's shoulder, sometimes she just watched her read aloud. And every time, Naomi felt the weight of the mansion pressing outside the door, the wealth, the marble floors, the cold commands. But inside that tiny room, there had been warmth. Now in the courtroom, that warmth carried Clara's trembling voice like a torch against the dark. The cross-examination began. Richard's lead attorney, a sharp-jawed man with a gleaming watch, stepped forward. He adjusted his glasses, his voice syrup-smooth. "Clara, you love Naomi, don't you?" Clara nodded sly. "Owly. She was kind to you, read to you, gave you comfort when you felt alone. Isn't that right?" Another nod. "And you don't want to see her punished, do you?" Clara's throat worked. "No." The lawyer spread his hands, turning toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. A child protecting someone she loves. She imagines a villain, her own father, so that the defendant may walk free. A tragic but understandable story of loyalty. But loyalty is not truth." Clara's eyes brimmed with tears. Naomi's nails dug into her palm. Then Clara spoke, her voice breaking, but strong enough to slice through the lawyer's honeyed tone. "I'm telling the truth," she said. "I was scared before, but I'm not scared anymore." The gallery stirred. The lawyer faltered, his rehearsed rhythm breaking. Richard couldn't contain himself. He rose, ignoring the tug of his attorneys. His voice thundered across the room. "You will take that back, Clara. Do you hear me? You will not shame me in front of these people." The words rang with a violence no one could deny. Gasps broke from the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. Isabel clutched the edge of her seat, her face ashen. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. "Mr. Halden, one more outburst and I will hold you in contempt." But it was too late. The jury had seen it. They had heard it. The mask of the polished billionaire had crumbled into the raw fury of a man exposed. Naomi pressed a hand to her mouth. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not of fear this time, but of vindication. For so long she had carried the burden of lies, but now the truth stood naked in the light, delivered not by her, but by the child she had once cradled in a quiet room. The recess bell rang again, but no one rushed for the doors. The crowd lingered, murmuring, the air thick with disbelief and revelation. Naomi remained seated as the bailiff escorted Clara from the stand. Just before leaving, Clara turned, her eyes finding Naomi's. For the first time, there was no fear, only quiet relief. Richard sat stone. Still, his hands gripping the table so tightly his knuckles blanched. His empire had not yet fallen, but its foundations were splintering beneath him. Naomi's lawyer leaned close, whispering, "This changes everything." Naomi nodded faintly. She could barely speak past the lump in her throat. For the first time since this nightmare began, she allowed herself to hope. That night, Naomi didn't go straight home. Instead, she walked by the river, the Charleston lights shimmering on the water's surface. She stopped on the bridge, gripping the railing, letting the cold night air fill her lungs. For weeks she had carried shame like a chain. Tonight, for the first time, she felt it loosen. Clara had broken it with a child's courage, but Naomi knew the fight wasn't over. Richard Halden would not surrender easily. Tomorrow the war of words would rage harder than ever. Still, as she looked at the water's reflection, she whispered to herself, "I'm not alone anymore." And for the first time, she believed it. The morning sun poured through the courthouse windows, golden light streaking across polished marble floors. Outside, the building swarmed with reporters, their microphones flashing like bayonets, their questions shouted into the cool autumn air. "Did you hear Clara's testimony? Is Richard Halden finished? Will Naomi Clark walk free?" Inside, the air was thicker, charged, heavy with expectation. Naomi walked slowly down the corridor, her back straight despite the exhaustion in her bones. Her navy dress, simple and unadorned, stood in stark contrast to the sleek suits and tailored gowns around her. She had no armor but her dignity, yet it seemed to carry her more steadily than all of Richard Halden's wealth. When she entered the courtroom, she felt the shift immediately. Eyes that once glanced at her with suspicion now lingered with curiosity, even sympathy. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. Richard Halden sat at the defense table, a storm brewing behind his gray eyes. His lawyers whispered urgently, but Richard's jaw remained locked, his gaze fixed on the jury. His cufflinks were perfectly polished, his suit flawless, but his composure was cracked. Isabel sat a few rows behind, her designer scarf pulled tight around her neck, her posture brittle. She hadn't spoken to her husband since yesterday's outburst, but her silence said everything. Her loyalty was a mask, and now even that mask seemed ready to shatter. Across the room, Clara entered with her child advocate. Her steps were hesitant, but her chin was slightly lifted. She glanced once at Naomi, and Naomi gave her a small, reassuring smile. The bailiff's voice echoed, "All rise." The judge wasted no time. "We resume testimony. The defense may call its next witness." Richard's attorney rose, smoothing his tie. "The defense calls Isabel Halden." A ripple moved through the gallery. Isabel rose, her heels clicking against the floor. She walked carefully to the stand, every step radiating fragility. Naomi watched her closely. For years, Isabel had seemed untouchable, beautiful, cold, a woman sculpted from ice. But now Naomi saw the cracks, the slight tremor in her hand as she took the oath, the flicker of uncertainty in her pale blue eyes. The lawyer began. "Mrs. Halden, you are Clara's mother. Tell us, is it possible your daughter was confused, frightened, and influenced by the defendant?" Isabel hesitated. Her gaze darted toward Richard, whose eyes burned into her like steel. For a moment, silence stretched, and Naomi thought Isabel would lie as she always had, bending beneath Richard's will. Then Isabel's lips parted. Her voice, soft but steady, carried across the room. "No," she said. "Clara isn't confused." Gasps erupted. Richard stiffened, his face hardening into fury. Isabel clasped her hands tightly on the stand, her knuckles white. "I saw it myself. Richard. He loses his temper. He doesn't mean to, but when he's angry, he grabs too hard. I should have said something sooner." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge banged his gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" Naomi's eyes widened. Isabel, brittle Isabel, had finally broken her silence. Richard shot up from his chair. "You traitor!" His voice boomed, raw with disbelief. The judge's gavel cracked again. "Mr. Halden, sit down immediately." But Richard was beyond control. He pointed at Isabel, his face twisted with rage. "After everything I gave you, everything I built for you, you dare stand against me?" Isabel's shoulders shook, but she didn't look away. For the first time in her life, she faced him head-on. "I dare," she whispered. The gallery was in uproar. Reporters scribbled furiously, some whispering into phones. The empire of Richard Halden was collapsing before their eyes, not with a single blow but with the voices of those closest to him. Naomi sat frozen, her heart pounding. This was no longer just her defense, it was the unraveling of a man who had built his power on silence, on fear. And yet, a flicker of pity stirred in her chest. She had seen this before, the way abusive men wielded control until it became the only language they knew. Richard Halden was a tyrant, but he was also a man terrified of losing the one thing he couldn't buy back: obedience. The judge called for order again, threatening to clear the courtroom. When silence finally returned, he turned to Richard's counsel. "You may proceed, but I warn you, this court will not tolerate further outbursts." The lawyer's voice faltered as he continued. Isabel's testimony had rattled even him. He tried to spin it as exaggeration, as bitterness from a failing marriage. But the damage was done. The jury had seen Richard's fury. They had heard his daughter's trembling words. And now they had Isabel's confession. The ripple of reaction spread like wildfire, through the gallery, through the courthouse halls, through the reporters rushing to file their stories. For the first time, Richard Halden looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man cornered by truth. That evening, as Naomi left the courthouse, the crowd outside parted. Reporters called her name, microphones thrust forward, but she walked past them quietly, her head high. For weeks she had been vilified. Tonight, the air felt different. A woman stepped out from the crowd, a stranger, pressing a folded note into Naomi's hand before disappearing. Naomi opened it under the streetlight. It read, "We believe you. Keep fighting." Her chest tightened. For the first time since the nightmare began, she didn't feel entirely alone in the world. Inside his limousine, Richard Halden sat stone still, his fists clenched, the city lights flashing across his face like fire. His empire was crumbling in public view, and yet his pride would not allow him to bend. But the tide had turned. The voices once silenced had risen, and the world was listening. And Naomi, though weary, felt a strength stirring within her she thought she had lost forever. The courtroom was packed to its very edges. Word of Isabel Halden's shocking testimony had spread like wildfire overnight, and now every seat was filled with reporters, community members, and curious onlookers. The air hummed with a sense of history being written, as though everyone present knew they were about to witness the downfall of a man who had once seemed untouchable. Naomi sat at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes were steady, though the weight of the moment pressed against her ribs like a vice. She had been mocked, vilified, accused of being a monster. Yet now the tide was rising in her favor, and she could feel its power. Across the room, Richard Halden sat with a rigidity that bordered on stone. His silver hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his jaw locked so tight a vein pulsed angrily at his temple. His empire of intimidation had always worked, on board members, on employees, on his own family. But here, inside this courtroom, his power had begun to bleed away. The prosecutor rose, her voice ringing with quiet authority. "The state calls Detective Samuel Ortiz." Naomi straightened in her seat. Ortiz was a broad-shouldered man with deep-set eyes, his police badge catching the light as he stepped forward. His reputation was unshakable, calm, methodical, incorruptible. The oath was taken, and the questioning began. "Detective Ortiz," the prosecutor said, "did your investigation uncover evidence related to Clara Halden's injuries?" "Yes," Ortiz replied firmly. "We collected photographs and medical reports. The bruises were consistent with forceful grabbing, not accidental falls." The prosecutor nodded. "And in your professional opinion, were these injuries consistent with abuse?" "Yes." The room stirred. Naomi could hear the pens scratching furiously as journalists noted every word. Richard's attorney shot up. "Objection, speculation." "Sustained," the judge replied, though his eyes betrayed his own unease with Richard's unraveling defense. But the damage had been done. Ortiz's words lingered like a thundercloud. Then came the moment no one expected. The prosecutor stepped closer. "Detective Ortiz, during your investigation, did you discover any attempts to silence or intimidate witnesses?" Richard's head snapped up. His attorney shifted uneasily. Ortiz's gaze flicked toward Naomi, then back to the jury. "Yes, multiple witnesses, including staff members of the Halden household, reported being threatened with termination and legal retaliation if they spoke about what they saw." The room fell into a hush so deep it seemed the walls themselves were listening. Naomi's throat tightened. She thought of the maids who had avoided. Her eyes in the halls, of the gardener who had once whispered, "Be careful." She realized now that she had not been imagining it. The silence around Richard Halden had been enforced, not chosen. Richard slammed a fist against the table, making several jurors flinch. "Lies!" he barked. "You're all conspiring against me." The judge's gavel cracked down. "Mr. Halden, you are out of order." But Richard was beyond control. He stood, his face flushed red with rage, his voice booming across the courtroom. "Do you think any of this matters? I built this city. I made fortunes for men who sit on your juries. I paid for your campaigns." His finger jabbed toward the judge, then toward the jury, his movements wild. "You're all nothing without me." The gallery erupted in gasps. Reporters scrambled, cameras flashing like lightning. And then, like a dam breaking, the illusion of Richard Halden collapsed. Isabel, sitting rigid in the front row, covered her face with trembling hands. Clara pressed herself against her advocate's side, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The judge's voice thundered over the chaos. "Mr. Halden, control yourself, or I will have you removed from this courtroom." But Richard only laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Remove me? Do you know who I am?" At that, Naomi rose, not out of defiance, but because she felt it was time. Her voice cut through the storm. "You're a man," she said softly. The words silenced the room. Richard turned toward her, his fury momentarily stunned by the simplicity of her statement. Naomi met his gaze, unblinking. "Just a man. No more, no less. And the world sees you now. All of you." The jury stared at her, their faces lit with a new awareness. The gallery leaned in closer. Even the judge paused, the gavel still in his hand. Richard's attorney tried desperately to regain control, but the trial had shifted irreversibly. The jury had witnessed Richard's unmasked arrogance, his desperation, his violence, not just in whispers but in full public display. The prosecutor seized the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen of this jury, you have now seen not only the evidence but the man himself. You have heard his daughter's trembling voice, you have listened to his wife's confession, you have watched him attempt to bully this very courtroom. You must ask yourselves, is this the voice of innocence or the roar of guilt unmasked?" Silence fell again, but this time it was heavy with understanding. The trial stretched late into the evening. Naomi sat quietly, her hands still, her heart steady in her chest. When the judge finally announced that the jury would deliberate the next morning, the room emptied with murmurs of anticipation. Naomi remained in her seat for a moment, absorbing the quiet after the storm. Her life had been dragged through humiliation, through suspicion, through near destruction. But tonight, as she finally stood to leave, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. Outside, reporters clamored, their voices filling the night. Flashes burst like fireworks. But Naomi walked past them untouched, her gaze fixed forward. The next day would bring the verdict, and whatever the outcome, she knew one truth above all. She had already won back her name, her dignity, her voice. The jury room door opened at precisely 10:47 a.m. The sound was small, just the creak of wood against hinges, but in the charged silence of the courtroom, it felt like thunder. Naomi sat at the defense table, her palms pressed flat against her skirt to stop their trembling. She had not slept, though exhaustion cloaked her like a second skin. Clara's words, Isabel's confession, Richard's outbursts, she had replayed them all in her mind 100 times. Yet no matter how she tried to predict the outcome, she could not prepare her heart for this moment. Richard Halden sat opposite her, stiff as marble. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight, but he had forced his expression into a mask of indifference. The billionaire who once commanded boardrooms with ease now looked like a man bracing against a storm he could no longer control. The jurors filed in one by one, their faces unreadable. Naomi watched them carefully, searching for clues in the lines of their brows, the set of their mouths. But the truth was hidden until the foreperson stood. The judge's voice carried through the still air. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The clerk took the slip of paper, unfolded it, and handed it to the judge. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then the judge read aloud, "On the charge of aggravated assault against a minor, we the jury find the defendant, Richard Halden, guilty." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, cries, the frantic clicking of cameras. Clara buried her face into her advocate's shoulder, her small body trembling. Isabel wept openly, her hands covering her mouth. Reporters scrambled, their pens flying, their lenses snapping. And Naomi closed her eyes, a single tear sliding down her cheek. She was free. Richard's face contorted, his mask finally breaking. He slammed his fists on the table, his voice cracking like a whip. "This is a setup, a conspiracy. I'll destroy every last one of you." But the words rang hollow. Two bailiffs closed in on him, their hands firm on his arms. For the first time in his life, Richard Halden's power meant nothing. He was just a man in handcuffs, dragged away as the world watched. As he was escorted out, Clara lifted her head. Her eyes, still red from tears, followed her father. "Daddy," she whispered, not in longing, but in something sharper, sadder. It was the sound of a child saying goodbye to an illusion. The judge called for order. Sentencing would come later, but the verdict was clear. The trial was over. Naomi stood slowly, her knees almost giving way beneath her. She felt the eyes of the gallery on her, some filled with admiration, some with curiosity, some simply stunned. A hush fell as she walked toward the exit, and then something unexpected happened. And the gallery rose. One by one, people stood, not in silence but in quiet respect. Some nodded, some whispered her name, others simply looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a maid, not as an accused criminal, but as a woman who had stood against a giant and endured. Naomi's throat tightened. She lowered her gaze, humbled, and kept walking. Outside, the courthouse steps were a sea of flashing cameras and microphones. Reporters shouted questions. "Naomi, how do you feel after the verdict? Do you have a message for Richard Halden?" What comes next for you? But Naomi didn't answer. She didn't need to. She descended the marble steps slowly, deliberately, the autumn air cool against her skin. For the first time in months, the world felt open again. Clara's small voice called out behind her. "Miss Naomi?" Naomi turned. The little girl broke free from her advocate and rushed forward, throwing her arms around Naomi's waist. Naomi dropped to her knees, hugging her back tightly. "Thank you," Clara whispered into her ear, "for not being afraid." Naomi's heart cracked open. She smoothed Clara's hair, pressing her cheek against the crown of her head. "You're braver than all of us, Clara. Don't ever forget that." Isabel approached then, her face streaked with tears. She paused, struggling to find words. "Naomi, I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to say, I'm sorry. For my silence. For all of it." Naomi rose, meeting Isabel's eyes. There was no warmth there, not yet. But there was no hatred either. Only a quiet acknowledgement that healing would take time. "Do better for her," Naomi said, nodding toward Clara. Isabel nodded, her lips trembling. Later that evening, Naomi returned to her small apartment. The city hummed outside her window, alive with movement, with stories, with noise. She set her keys down on the table and sank into the silence. She thought of her mother's words, spoken long ago when Naomi was still a child in Georgia. "They'll try to take your voice, baby. But the day you stop speaking is the day they've won." Naomi smiled faintly. She hadn't stopped speaking. Even when the world refused to hear her, she had held her ground. Her name was Naomi Clark. She was more than a maid, more than an accusation, more than what anyone had tried to make her. She was whole again. The camera of imagination pulls back, drifting out the window, over the glowing streets, past the courthouse steps still littered with reporters' footprints. The city moves on, as it always does. But for one woman, and one little girl, the world has shifted forever. Justice, fragile and flawed as it is, had found its way through, and Naomi, at last, was free to breathe.